So I'm Milo Jones, and I am the interviewer, if you will, today. And I thought, even though you have the biographies of the speakers here in your program, it might be useful to start by each of us saying a little bit about who we are and what our background is. So, Jonathan, do you want to start?
Thank you, Milo, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very glad to have the chance to be at this event. I'm a game theorist and an economist. Normally, I study legal trafficking, financial markets, and regulation in telecoms. But I have done some work in some related areas, for example, drug trafficking and organized crime. I mainly work on complex systems and networks, and so I'm interested in seeing how the theories that I study can be applied in this particularly challenging context. Right?
Hi, I'm Ray Kozlowski. I'm a political scientist. I teach international relations and international organization. My early research was actually on the Maastricht Treaty, European citizenship, intra-EU migration, dual nationality with the Council of Europe, and I gradually worked my way to studying the United States and border control, border security, international cooperation on human smuggling, and more recently on the use of information technology for border controls.
Sarah.
Hello. I'm Sara Webb, and I'm a researcher from the UK. I've spent 20 years conducting research within the criminal justice system within the UK, and a number of those studies have been around the subject of organised crime. I'm here today on the basis of a study that was published by the Home Office in 2009, which was an unusual study in that we interviewed 45 convicted prisoners, so that people within prison who had been convicted of immigration crime. And we published a report based on this, and within the sample we included both people responsible for facilitating and human smuggling, as we called it, and also people convicted of crimes related to trafficking. So that's my area of focus today.
Antonio.
I'm Antonio Saccone. I play at home here because I work for Frontex, so I'm the only one who is part of the organization. As a background, I'm a police officer. I'm an officer from Guardia di Finanza from Italy, and I've been working here in Frontex for 5 years, where I am responsible for the risk analysis. We follow, let's say, provide support to our operations by providing awareness about the risks and about, so we aggregate knowledge somehow at the European Union level on the risks and on what we see in terms of illegal migration in Europe.
Thank you. I'm Milo Jones, and I've been asked to host this because, among other things, I have a book coming out with Stanford University Press later this year called Constructing Cassandra, The Social Construction of Strategic Surprise at the CIA, 1947 to 2001. And that volume looks at how the culture and identity of an organization charged with preventing strategic surprise actually helps shape and create the types of strategic surprise that the United States experienced. Our agenda today, we want this to be an interactive session. I thought we'd do about half our time answering my questions, and then hopefully half our time answering the questions that we generate in the audience as a result of our initial remarks. I did want to open, picking up with a theme from this morning, where Dr. Betts spoke of the myths and that the effect of a lack of a working theory of migration, the practical effects that might have. Everyone knows the phrase known unknowns from, of course, Donald Rumsfeld, but I don't think many of us appreciated the degree to which there are so many known unknowns in migration, particularly illegal migration. And I would just start with Antonio elaborating a bit on something that surprised me, which is that Frontex does not know everything that individual European countries know.
Okay, maybe I should elaborate a bit on first what we know and how we know it shortly, and then this can lead to the second part, of what we do not know, which is much more, I would say, than what we do know. One of the issues that we've been quite successful over the last 10 years in building up knowledge. Before 10 years, in 2003, we established a common model. We call it Common Integrated Risk Analysis Model, where we set up a common methodology. When I say C, I mean us. I say member states, all the authorities of member states and Frontex together. There was a working group which was created to come up with common definitions and come with a common methodology to collect data and to analyze the data and to come up with common results. Before that, we didn't have any comparable mean of coming to some conclusions. And when you want to aggregate knowledge from different countries, this is essential. So we got to the point where we could agree on a set of indicators, and since then we have been getting data. Data have been collected at the national level with the same indicators, with the same understanding of the indicator. And what we do now, we are able to see in our work what are the hotspots. And for each of the indicators, for example, illegal border crossings, of a number of falsified documents, type of falsified documents, where they are detected, and so on. So we know, I would say, pretty well. We have a barometer where, on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, we receive this data. These data have been validated at the national level, at the statistical, with the statistical methodology, and we know what happens there. We have integrated this with a very good relationship with our partners in the member states. We have created a community. We call it the Frontex Risk Analysis Community. We abbreviate it as FRAN, where our partners are, those who provide the data to us, are sharing the findings, the reporting. So there is also a common development towards better results. And we have complemented that as well with, let's say, regional networks of the same type of indicators, also gathered by countries which are neighboring the European Union. For example, Western Balkans, the Eastern border, our border with the Eastern partners, and some other regional networks that we are developing, like in Africa at the moment. All of this, together with our reporting system that we have in our joint operation, the operations that we organized to support the local authorities on the field, give us a pretty good understanding of the situation at the border. And to get there, we have invested a lot of resources, a lot of efforts, and we need a lot of resources and efforts, and it costs money and resources to collect and maintain this system. The problem is that we do not know what happens before they come to the border, and we don't know what happens after.
Yeah, I was struck by your use of the phrase, we have a pretty good idea of what happens at the border, which of course is a very different thing from knowing anything about
we have, I will even add, we know pretty well what we do detect at the border. There is a part of unknown, they say dark figures, that we cannot measure statistically. So another question mark is, how would you get this type of information, for example? I think you may have something to contribute to that. I can articulate more of which types of information we would like to know, but I would like to stop it here at the moment, focusing on, for example, what was said this morning about the geopolitical developments, the difficulty to forecast, and how much we need to know what's going on now in crisis areas to be able to understand the level of risk and how this can impact on our border.
Does anyone have anything specific they'd like to add to Antonia's preliminary remarks before we move on to those broader questions of what we might call push factors?
Well, if I might, the known unknown that we're mostly thinking about are those illegal border crossers who are not detected in any way, shape, or form, and we're trying to get at that. But there's also those if you will, those statistics of what can be known but is still unknown. So again, I've been asking this question about the total number of the world's travelers, global mobility in the world. How many people enter through official border crossing points through all of 193 UN member states? Again, we should know.
That's eminently knowable.
It's knowable.
Yet, so it's a known.
But that statistic is not collected by the United Nations. We use this 200 million migrants that we saw Alex Betts with the graph, et cetera. But those are people who stay for over a year outside of their country of nationality. Alex also mentioned 1 billion. Yes, 1 billion now, which is the number of arrivals that the UN World Travel Organization indicates that we have just reached in 2012. But that's, again, the entries. Now, if all those people were to return home in the same year, then we're looking at 2 billion. Now, of course, that's not the case. People travel to several countries, so it may be less.
It's a flow versus a stock, and even then it's an imperfect measure of a not very relevant flow.
But the thing is that I think it's that number of global mobility, that's the number that people here would be concerned about. I mean, how many people are entering in through official border crossing points in terms of management, the work that Frontex is doing in terms of collecting this data so that you can better manage the external border, but thinking about it more broadly. And then, of course, how many people not only enter, the entry statistics, but how many leave, the exit statistics.
It would seem a useful point of departure, particularly because, of course, as laws change, if you restrict the legal migration, which you could be counting, you probably have an effect on the illegal migration. At least we can assume that perhaps safely, although some of you might feel we can't even assume that.
Well,
we may not have, without an overarching theory, it's hard to be sure.
There's that, and then again, I don't know the situation in Europe as well now, but in the United States, the estimates of, there are estimates that there are 11 million unauthorized migrants in the United States, and between 30 and 45% have overstayed the terms of their visa. So again, this is one of those known unknowns that could be known.
Yeah, when it comes to the European Union, for the figures, we have a number of, we that define this as overstayers, people who enter with a legal visa, with a legal permission to come for study reasons or for any other reason which is foreseen by the Schengen Code, and they overstay, they exceed the expiration of the time for a legal stay, so they become overstayers. We, in average, looking at the statistics, we in Europe, in the European Union, we detect between 100 and 120,000 overstayers per year. We don't know how many are illegal yet. We, in fact, cannot measure this at the moment because we don't have an entry-exit system. So we have estimates. I would not even say good figures about traffic we have at airports, but it's when it comes to border crossing points at land or ports, it's much more different, the situation. To count everyone would take a lot of resources. So we have quite poor estimates about general volume of traffic at sea and land. We do not have an entry-exit system, so this is one of the things that we should solve, deciding how to create, and there has been work done in creating one entry-exit system. Another thing is that we do not know, we don't have a link, a very well-established link at the European level between the consular authorities and the border guard authorities everywhere, which it is somewhere, but not everywhere. So we don't know, we don't have the way at the moment to estimate to which extent the legal travel arrangements and flows are impacting on illegal immigration. We, as I said, we know what we detect because the people land by boats on our shores, or they try to cross but people who try to enter legally and then overstay or in a more subtle way, this is still a part of the phenomenon which we are not actually measuring, if not the number of detections that we have inland.
Jonathan, you looked like you were
Yeah,
ready to dive in.
Yeah, there were a number of issues that came up in that I just wanted briefly to highlight. The first is the endogeneity question. The things that we record or data are things that we thought were significant or have incentives to collect. The thing about not collecting exit data is precisely because there was a policy emphasis on how many people were coming in. That was the terms of the debate. The result is that when we try to make models of these data and predict what's going to happen, we try to build models that do what the data did, even if the data are only telling us part of the pictures. What we're not trying to do is to understand, as Antonio suggested, the reasons why people come and be able to get leading indicators of what those might be. Now, part of that might simply be in the way in which we collect the data. Instead of just recording entries and exits, tracking network flows would be obviously much more important, because the routes through which people come give us a chance to observe them in different ways. The other thing is that because people can choose between legal and illegal or more observed and less observed routes of entry, there's a selection bias. The ones that you see coming in, even if you interviewed them as to why they came, would not be representative of the flow as a whole. So we would be building, in a sense, the wrong kind of models. Yeah, that's probably enough for now.
Sarah's work actually tried to get to the bottom of some of these questions by interviewing people who indeed had been caught, and I believe you bumped up against some pretty questions one would expect with regards to whether these people are reliable narrators, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps you want to briefly touch on that.
I mean, very, very much so. Again, it gets back to the question of how representative a sample is. We introduced 45 people who'd been convicted within the UK. In other words, we spoke to the people who'd got caught. That doesn't tell you very much about who didn't get caught. And interestingly, looking back at the stories of some of those individuals, you could argue that they were certainly the least effective at the kind of work they were doing. I mean, just a couple of anecdotes. One person who had been apprehended for importing people into the UK had been, via boat along the shores, had been apprehended when the motor on his boat failed, and he found himself floating around in a regatta on the south coast of England. Another person we interviewed was a fairly low-level member of an organised crime group whose job was to cross the channel in a car, pick up people who were issued with false passports, and bring them back in. He got caught because he got greedy, and as well as the 4 people who were travelling on false documentation, he'd stuck 2 people in his boot, charged them some extra money. When he got to the UK border, the car was searched, they found the 2 people in the boot. Had they not been there, the other 4 might well have carried on, and he would never have been picked up. So the question is, as I say, how successful these people are and how they represent particularly organised crime groups, many of whom will be operating at a very successful level. The other main point, I think, in terms of using these people as a sort of information was that interestingly, particularly people who had been apprehended for trafficking offences, they were very reluctant to admit their part in any of the activity, despite the fact they had been convicted for those offences. So a high proportion of them claimed actually they'd had nothing to do with it, it was a miscarriage of justice. On the other hand, these people then went on, or would be more willing to say, I didn't do anything, I wasn't involved in it, but I do know that this happens, and would then give an account of the process for getting people, either smuggling people in or trafficking them in. And interestingly, in terms of the findings, I think what is interesting, although possibly disappointing, is that from this small group of very disparate people, there was a degree of consensus in the findings from these interviews with, for instance, publications put out by Europol. I mean, that some of the patterns matched, the methods matched, and some of the findings about how these organised crime groups were organised match. So to some extent, that could argue that there is some veracity in what they say. but on the other hand, maybe it would have been helpful if they came up with something different that wasn't perhaps already picked up by other sources of information.
The complicating factor in this known unknown is something that I believe Jonathan's work has touched upon, which is the degree to which it is actually in the interest of smart smugglers for dumb smugglers, dumb people smugglers to be caught, and therefore the iceberg, the size of the iceberg will be even harder to detect if there is in fact the major part of the iceberg are the smart ones. Could you briefly talk about the dynamic that's at work there?
Yeah, I think this is one of these peculiar phenomena you observe in a number of areas of criminal activity, including drug trafficking and drug interdiction. As Sarah suggests, it is the new entrants, the inexperienced ones, the stupid ones who tend to get caught. Catching them uses enforcement resources. They may not therefore be efficiently targeting the ones who are responsible for most of the harm. But if you catch the novices, if you catch a steady stream of these easy-to-catch people, that does two things. The first is it prevents the profits and the solidity of the established core, the experienced core of the industry, from facing competition that would reduce their profitability. The fact that their profits remain high, encourage people who may wish to enter the industry to think that it's an attractive industry to enter. They see the prizes of the people who persist, they don't see the people who get rapidly removed, and they think, I could come in too. So there's a steady stream of people to catch. You can look as though you're catching lots of people, but the people at the core of the industry are doing better. Now, what makes the difference between catching the stupid ones and catching the smart ones? Well, it's the difference between things like technical means of surveillance, automated systems for detecting patterns, and more intensive police work, where you infiltrate networks, where you come to understand the dynamics of how these things are built. It's more expensive, it takes longer to pay off, but it may get closer to the heart of the problem. The other thing is, of course, it gives you a distorted view of how smart these people are. And Ray was saying earlier that there's been a process where you move from mom and pop smugglers, where everybody is a sort of cottage industry, towards a more industrialized and smarter and sophisticated version of that industry. It would be a shame if our efforts to deal with the consequences of this traffic led to a transformation into a form where it was much harder to make progress.
Ray, I think you were speaking specifically in the U.S. context, and I don't know whether that has already happened in Europe or whether, sadly, the efforts of many of the people in this room are busily creating that dynamic.
Well, when it comes to the point of catching the smart ones rather than the lower ones in the ranks, we come with two difficulties in general, putting the things together in general. One is the exposure of the smart ones to the first line, the most dangerous parts of the business. We don't see them risking. I mean, they delegate the risky activities to people who are lower ranks. For example, the most dangerous part in our business, in border, the border control part, is the physical crossing of the border, or accompanying someone for trafficking human beings and being accompanied there for security reasons, let's say. There you have a chance to catch these people. But these are not the ones who are in control, who are, let's say, organizers and so on. And these people, the second problem is that these people are hidden in another jurisdiction. They may be in Baghdad, they may be living in a failed state which doesn't have any form of international law enforcement or judicial cooperation with our countries, and this is an obvious problem. And then there are problems, the normal problems of international cooperations that take some time to get to the point. When you got for a rogatory letter, you request for assistance to flow, you follow the money. You have a bank account that has been used, you have it in interview, and you want to know who is the owner of this bank account. And then the answer may come after 1 year. So these are the usual, let's say, law enforcement that may impact on the situation. And I would say our situation in the European Union may be a bit different from the United States, where you may have within, for example, your area of source, and your country a different relationship with the countries of transit and origin that we may do have with countries which are much more remote in terms of geography, like Afghanistan, Somalia, or Central or Sub-Saharan Africa. I think all this is play a bit the problems.
So, from what everyone said, I guess we should all place our hope in technical fixes.
That's a strange kind of hope, because there's a festina lente aspect to this, right? That you want to hurry slowly, because what you do will be adapted to. And it may be that we learn more by not doing the best that we can. There's an optimization rule about that. It's sometimes called simulated annealing in complex systems.
We may learn more by not doing our
best.
best. I hope there are no school children in this room.
I mean, so what I'm saying is the following. There are two payoffs to anything that we do here. One is the direct payoff, that we stop an instance of trafficking. The other is the value of the information that we acquire. And if we always go after the low-hanging fruit, we will do that until there is no more low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, it's a classic counterintelligence problem. That are you catching the people, or are you getting to the root of the problem?
And I think what I'm saying in the Frontex type of context is that the value of collecting information and exchanging it with other jurisdictions, for example, with failed states, people sitting on an island with a sat phone and coordinating this activity and so on, that value of the collective use of that information to manage in a coordinated fashion the causes and consequences of this traffic is far higher than the thing that you're personally held responsible for at the micro level. It's a collective problem, and the flow of information there needs to be some recognition of that value so that you don't have resources taken away that would prevent you from collecting that information.
So it's almost as if there are perverse incentives to do nothing other than collect information.
Well, I just, the way I see it, and as an outsider, the border guards are, for me, yes, they're walls and gates and gatekeepers, and obviously that's an important function, but they're also eyes and ears. And the point about where people come from, they can also have community relations. When people come into the European area, they will go very often to communities of the people from the countries from which they came. Those communities may include legal immigrants, people integrated into the economy, who are not best pleased about these flows because they're tarred with that brush. As with terrorism, they may be the best source of information if the right relationships can be sustained. But if the function is kept narrowly focused on law enforcement at the point of entry and no deeper, then it's very difficult to avoid losing that opportunity.
One complicating factor, if I could add one, I think Sara touched upon earlier in the day when we were chatting, and that is that there is, of course, the additional problem of distinguishing between illegal migration and people trafficking, which, of course, they can be coming in legally, and that's an entirely different data set. If you could expand briefly on that.
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at if you're looking at it, say in terms of harms to communities, you could argue that trafficking has an obvious harm to the victims and may have a knock-on effect wherever they're based. But the big challenge for anyone operating at the border is that certainly in the cases we were looking at, a very high proportion of the people who were trafficked into the UK had actually entered legally. They were young women from within Europe. So the question there is, as border guards, where does your responsibility lie in terms of trying to identify that? And are there any risk factors, or are there any indicators that you can rely upon that can help you to perhaps determine that a woman might be being brought in against her will? But again, it gets more complicated, because in interviewing people who had been involved in trafficking, they all claimed that actually these young women were not being brought in against their will, that they were not being forced over borders, because you can't do that. That would attract attention. the argument would be well, maybe they didn't know what their fate was. But again, they would claim, a number of them claimed, that in fact they knew that these are young women who were already working as prostitutes in their own original country, and that they felt the economic advantages would be greater by moving to another country. Again, it's a very contentious point. They would say that, wouldn't they? But maybe it's something worth considering, that it's another complicating factor in a way to consider.
Antonio, you had something to add there?
Yeah, when I was listening to Jonathan and now what Sara was saying, Jonathan was talking about the lack of the fact that concentrating only on border control at the border without a proper understanding of what happens inland, which is one of our other known unknowns, is a problem. And on the other hand, what Sara said about the issue of trafficking human being exploitation, that sometimes they come in legally, or we don't know how this can be relevant for border control. And this I wanted to reflect on the fact that in our integrated border management model, we are aware of the importance of inland activities, of investigations, or reversing all the information gathered during investigations on trafficking human beings, on illegal migration networks, and other cross-border crimes, to somehow synthesize this information, put it out of the judicial process, knowledge of the law enforcement who has been doing the investigation, the crime part, and give back to the border guards knowledge in terms, for example, of profiling of victims, in terms of warnings, early warnings for the border guards, to be able to be fully aware of what is being known and gathered in other processes by maybe the same police force, but by another section or by another police force inland. This looks obvious, but it doesn't happen always. We have been trying to do this recently. We have even published some handbooks on profiling of, for example, people exploited sexually, so to give this knowledge. But this is a big area where we can improve, and we have to try to develop a bit more this link between knowledge which is held by different police organizations or by different sections of police inland and at the border. And this is very, very important aspect to take into account.
Before we get to questions, and I assume there's been plenty of fodder for questions already stated, but I just wanted to touch on Ray's expertise about the technical efforts happening in North America on the border and the degree to which they're gathering different types of data and they're ending up with different known unknowns, so to speak, and the applicability of any of those technologies to the European context.
Well, one thing that came up here was in terms of the technical fixes, and one approach that had been taken in the United States with passage of the Secure Fence Act in 2006 was the so-called virtual fence, or the Secure Border Initiative Network, SBINet. And this plan was to have 1,800 towers that would have sensors and video to zoom in and to provide a common operating picture of the border, and then also automated dispatching of Border Patrol to, once it's decided, no, that's not an animal tripping a sensor, it's a group of illegal aliens, then to address that. Now, that plan, well, it didn't work out. It really, basically 28 miles at a very high cost. There were a lot of problems with using off-the-shelf police dispatching systems that couldn't handle the data elements, problems in terms of, actually many of the problems that had to do with not consulting the Border Patrol, the users, the ultimate users, as to how it might work, that they would utilize this system. And there was a reevaluation to move more to mobile. And then now we're seeing another switch with legislation currently being considered by the Senate in comprehensive immigration reform. And that is to focus on situational awareness by virtue largely of UAVs. So we're in the legislation, there will be money available to have 24-hour coverage 7 days a week with unarmed, and it's very specific about that in the legislation, unarmed unmanned aerial vehicles, also using radar and also satellite imagery to the extent to which it can be used. And the idea here, and the legislators are very explicit about it, they want to know the known unknown. And the way to do it is to utilize, now there are sensors, cameras that are being developed by DARPA. If you want to think of it this way.
DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which does high-level research, blue sky research for the Defense Department in the United States.
Yeah, but actually developed by BAE Systems, practically speaking, and it's 368 chips, camera chips, just like in your cell phone, that can survey large areas, and then to zoom in on targets. I shouldn't say targets. Zoom in on areas, shall we say, of interest. With I think it's 1.8 gigabyte video camera that can actually detect color of your shirt. So if you think about this,
Gorgon stare, and it was used in Baghdad for a time, and quite successfully to a degree, because I'm deeply skeptical of technical fixes. Yet I can tell you, when Gorgon stare could be programmed to notice that 3 guys got into a car, drove around, went somewhat slowly past various American outposts, and then went home, never doing anything else, maybe you'd want to watch that location.
Exactly, and if you can just imagine this is going to be the biggest area of human smuggling in the United States is in the Sonoran Desert, in Arizona, large areas, large distances that have to be covered. So UAVs provide an opportunity to cover this area in a way, and in the same way detect certain movements on the ground, zero in on it. And the idea is to be able to know not only the border crossers that, legal border crossers that are detected, that are either turned back or gotaways, as they're termed, but those who might have made it as well.
Before we take questions, has anyone got any follow-up remarks? Antonio.
You put a focus on technical developments for getting knowledge and solve known unknown. I would emphasize another aspect, which is human intelligence. Let's say the development of activities or techniques that can help us to understand from those people who have experienced the travel, who have been through the pain and the process, and then
more researchers like Sara is where the money should go instead of to expensive systems.
Yeah, we have a source, which are the migrants themselves, at least those migrants who are willing to cooperate, and they have a wealth of information to give and a wealth of knowledge, even on organizers, on traffickers in the country of origin. They can tell us about the situation in the country of transit. What is going on in the countries of last when they depart to take, for example, the Mediterranean Sea, and they depart from the North African coast, or they come from the Near East, and so on. We can get the stories how they were in contact with the criminal organizations, how they were transported, if they got abuse, or if they get. And we have a wealth of information that we can develop from this source. So I would not neglect the human part, which is still a very, very valuable source of information. Also, as I said before, on the criminal side, we get information from criminal investigations inland, and we should make use of this as much as possible.
If I might just say, first, don't get me wrong, I've been actually quite critical of looking to technology as the solution, the engineering solution to problems. And I've been skeptical of quite a bit. But quite frankly, just thinking about the capabilities of the surveillance and thinking about, and again, what happens in the United States for our border patrol, et cetera, we often have military surplus used. There's a lot of military surplus coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan now. and it will probably be find a use. And it's just this particular approach is something that I think that we're going to get closer to getting that knowledge. Now, whether it'll be able to do something is another.
To a degree, we'll see more of the smart ones.
Maybe, or I don't know about that. But the other thing, just in terms of the research, and there are quite a few researchers who've been working. Wayne Cornelius at University of California, San Diego, for years doing interviews with Mexican communities, Doug Massey, the Mexican Migration Project, again, and getting incredible information about, well, how many, did you use a smuggler the first time, and then getting percentages and finding that, who uses them and who doesn't, first time, second time. And this kind of information is, indeed, I agree, is invaluable.
Jonathan?
Just a very brief comment on that. What I find interesting, obviously you need different types of information. So human intelligence, precisely because it is not predefined to fit into categories of what we thought to be significant, which technical information has to be, right? You have to choose certain things and define that in the parameters. You need to combine those. The same is true with behavioral profiling. We're now understanding behavioral indicators of performance in areas like financial trading, for example. They're much more powerful.
I was going to say, you don't need the predefined categories if you're going to go with neural programming, right? The software can find the patterns.
Well, yes. You can. The patterns
Neural
can be told to you.
networks
You can
can
learn to recognize them. But the other thing that came out that is latent in this, which I think is critically important, is that this is not just once and for all detection of fact. What happens is, if people's behavior changes, if the ways in which they conduct themselves change, that you need to know, even if the change was exogenous, was caused by the fact that a certain state failed or there was a drought or something. If they change as a result of enforcement activities or policy, that's vital, because you can't assume that a policy which addressed yesterday's problem will continue to be effective when people react to it. And so it's only through the continuous combination of these sources of information that we can sustain progress.
We started a bit late. I'm not sure we have to finish on time. I bet we do. Therefore, despite the fact that you can tell all of us could keep talking probably ad nauseum, I did want a chance to get some questions from the audience, if there are any. There's a very bright light in my eyes, so I can't see if there are any over there. So you may have to be bold and get up and walk this way. But there I can see one in the back, at least. If you could just briefly say who you are and state your question, that would be great.
Hello, my name is James Lipsett. I work with Antonio Saccone in his unit. I've been very interested in hearing what the panel says, but I've been looking with Antonio, and before I worked in Frontex, at investigating illegal migration and also looking at it from an intelligence point of view. But one thing over my experience, from what I've seen and what I'd be very interested in hearing from in the panel, and what is unknown and unknowable to me, is how successful organized crime groups, both in smuggling people, trafficking, and in drugs and narcotics, is how good they are, different nationalities and ethnic groups working across borders, managing to form links between each other, often unnaturally, and often vulnerable communities, vulnerable diasporas, are able or appear to be able to infiltrate into the crime low down or even high up into the criminal structures of host countries or transit countries. I wonder if the panel have any thoughts about how this is achieved on a macro or micro level, because it's hard enough for people to interact socially anyway. So how are they able to do this, organized crime gangs, and why are they so successful at it? Could
you give an example of such a is it between ethnicities? Is that what?
I think it is between ethnicities. You often find people who are stuck in transit countries are themselves sometimes integrated into the smuggling apparatus themselves and become victims, or sometimes they will marry into nationals of that country, persons who might be from the criminal community or have them as their girlfriends or boyfriends, and then infiltrate that way to go to border regions to bribe people or find people who do the smuggling who know the border areas. And I find it quite interesting how that operates. And I just wondered if there's any reflection on how that occurs on a micro level, with just like people across borders, or on a higher level, the organizers of these organized crime gangs, how they manage to work transnationally. I just think it's an interesting phenomenon. I'd be interested on the panel's experience and thoughts on that.
Jonathan, you look like you've got some thoughts.
I do. I think one of the things that I noticed, and this is particularly more in the drugs context perhaps than in the migration context, is the way money is a solvent. In Los Angeles, the cocaine trafficking gangs, cartels, Whitey Enterprises and Third World Incorporated, were the marketing arms of the two major collections of criminal gangs, the Bloods and the Crips. They were separate from them because the amount of money flowing through them was corrosive to the values and standards that provided governance within those gangs. So they tended to be people who were older, 30 years plus, and no longer active gang members, or younger and therefore difficult to prosecute. And they sort of sandwiched the gangs, they fed money to them, but they were separated from them. Now those were temporary, let's say, market identities, but they were very strongly conflicting and they didn't succeed in joining up. On the other hand, in getting certain services like violence services that you use to create and maintain such an enterprise, they outsourced to other ethnicities whose opportunity cost of providing violence was much lower. In this particular case, the Saigon Cowboys and the Hispanic gangs, who would rise through the ranks by committing acts of violence, and the less you knew the person you were attacking, the better it was, because it demonstrated how hard you were and how loyal. So there was a sense there in which those divisions were actually used as an input to create certain kinds of tensions and firewalls that enabled the organization to proceed. The other thing that I sort of thought was that from a network theory point of view, many of these identities, the fact that these flows follow immigrant patterns, draw on what used to be called the strength of weak ties. That when we look at these criminal enterprises embedded in their communities, there's a tendency to view them all as a network of the same kind. But there are certain latent connections that can be activated, for example, when somebody gets in trouble. That people who never had common cause with them before will make common cause. And you can develop and nurture those things as an asset to be drawn on at need. And I guess the most extreme example I can think of is the way cartels like the Medellin and particularly the Cali cartel provided public goods in those parts of Colombia where they were based in order to create a sustainable bulwark against enforcement activities. So not at the micro level of how it's operating, but the sort of macroeconomic causes of maintaining these things, I think you've put your finger on a very important point.
Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think, I keep going to back to the fact it was a relatively small sample and not entirely representative. I think one of the most obvious findings from the interviews we conducted was in fact that certainly in terms of smuggling, it tended to be confined to fairly tight and discrete activities. So, for instance, people would be smuggled from a particular and possibly very small community within a region, maybe India or Asia, and through social and family ties, effectively, there would be some kind of link which would then introduce and move people into established communities within the UK. So it was a fairly closed process, by and large, that we came upon, that was described to us. I think what was quite interesting is that in terms of the people we interviewed they'd been convicted of criminal activity, a high proportion of them had at some point been irregular migrants themselves. So for whatever reason, they had arrived in the country, and it might be, again, through vulnerability, through poverty, through intimidation, they would then be effectively recruited back into that process.
So one of Jonathan's the strength of weak ties
Yes.
come into
yes.
play. Is there another question? Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panel for very interesting exchanges. I've got a simple question which I relay to you, because I'm from, by the way, IOM, and one of the questions our member states put to us is that which priority they should address when it comes to policy making that has to do with irregular migration. The question they put to us is the following: where is the priority? Is it overloading the asylum system? 2, clogging the labor market? 3, competing for access to social services, accommodation, welfare, and so on? Or is it indeed criminal activity or the threat of terrorism? It's a very tough question to address because all of them seem to be important, but I'd like to ask you, if you had to put your the emphasis on any one of them, where would you start?
Let's go in seriatim.
Okay. I think a lot of these separations reflect domestic political discourse, and they are ways of framing the issue that don't necessarily stand up in the sources of those flows or even in the nature. And I think one of the big challenges of the known unknowns is the difference between what is true and can be measured and what is believed. And that's the beliefs of the people who put themselves forward to be smuggled or to provide smuggling services as to whether they're going to be caught, why they're doing it, what they might hope to gain, and what they risk, and the beliefs of the people in the country as to what the consequences are. The fact that we can't put numbers on the illegal ones, the fact that there is this censorship, allows people to project all kinds of beliefs onto those for their own reasons. So that's point one. Point two is the artificiality of separating these things. It may be that people who come for asylum are coming for asylum from economic deprivation and intolerable conditions as much as from intolerable political conditions, or that the intolerable political conditions drive them away for economic reasons. And so therefore the separation between asylum seekers and economic migrants may not be so hard. Once they get here, if they come to a place that no longer offers adequate employment, they may find that criminal activity is the only way forward. And so the trajectory of these people takes them across all those boundaries. So I don't think that there is a separation that works in terms of the political discourse, the enforcement activity, and understanding the origins of the problem equally well. But that doesn't answer the question of where do you start? And the question, where do you start, I suppose, is where there is the most yet to do. Because I think my impression is that we understand rather more about some of these flows than others. Fixing up the gaps and joining up the knowledge might help, but that's where I defer over to Ray.
What Jonathan said put me in mind, if you were to look at the profile of the two brothers involved in the Boston bombing, which were terrorists, you'd see many of these factors at work, and it's harder to disentangle them. And I'm glad it's not my job to do so, but Ray.
Well, in terms of illegal migration, I feel uncomfortable saying, policy recommendations for the European Union. I'll stick to the United States. And in here, and I feel strongly about this, it's the labor market. Look, of that 11 million unauthorized migrants, it's estimated about 7.8 illegal migrant workers. We have 6 million employers, again, employ more than one or more people, right? There's 1.3 illegal migrants per employer in the United States, all right? In terms of worksite enforcement, it's changed a bit, but we were in the single digits in the number of employers who received fines for knowingly employing illegal migrant workers. So it was pretty clear what the message was, is, don't come, stop, we're building our fence. But if you get in, have I got a job for you? Huh? And this is the reality that until more focus is put on the demand for illegal migrant labor, one way or another, people will find their way around the fences, over the fences, as it used to be through Canada before they imposed visas on Mexicans. The largest apprehension rate, the majority were Mexicans coming across our northern border too. So again, it's that magnet. And until that's addressed, in many ways, a lot of the other efforts and a lot of the money that's being expended for a lot of that technology, I would say, could be more effectively used elsewhere.
So Europe just needs to stop trying to project soft power and be an attractive place, and the problem will be solved.
Well, liberalize your labor markets in ways that you probably don't want to do.
Sarah.
I think from my perspective, it's a difficult one to make a judgment on, and I accept the comments about the impact on the labour market. But I think from the work we did, I think in terms of numbers, it's probably a much smaller issue. But I think there has to be some concern and some focus on protecting vulnerable people who are deeply harmed by the activities of both smugglers and traffickers and the abuse that takes place there. I think that's...
Which would take the focus away from labor, because that, contrary to harming societies, those migrants contribute.
Yes.
They're net contributors, so it's a very different policy priority.
Could I make just a quick interjection, which is that if we have this form of dichotomy that you mentioned, that can be a selection device. You could regard that as something that selects the right migrants and deters the other. It selects the ones willing to take the risk. I mean, that's what we do when we put onerous conditions on startup finance for SMEs, right? I mean, Europe has a very unfriendly environment. The costs of entry are high, the costs of exit are even higher. You've got to be pretty sure that you can make an idea a success before you even try to make it fly. So you could make the argument that this is, in fact, from a broader perspective, an optimal strategy.
Okay.
And the Frontex perspective.
Okay, I feel quite uncomfortable giving you policy priorities for my role, and so I would rather reflect a bit on my experience of what we see, because the migration is a complex problem. It has problems of aspects of integration, of inside labor integration, social integration. These are things that I don't have an in-depth view on. So I would like to make a reflection on crime, on the part of crime, which, not to say that this is the most important priority, but what we see in terms of crime. And what strikes me is that virtually everyone who comes at our border in the way of, not in the legal way, but let's say coming through an illegal border crossing or through a clandestine entry, hidden on a cargo or something, almost all of them are entering contact at a certain point with a crime, with a criminal. So there is a moment when someone proposes them, we will help you to get in, and even people who are entitled to protection, to international protection, who could be just saying, I am an asylum seeker, I come from this country, this is very well known that I'm from an ethnicity or from a religion or from a particular condition which is so hostile to me that I am entitled by international law to. They also resort to the support of criminals, and they fall into a kind of trap, because they will put you on an uncomfortable situation where you are undocumented, even if you had your original document, and they create a bit of a vicious circles, which continues in the country of destination, because you will be probably put in contact with some elements of the gray or the black economy to work on with a very low wage on a restaurant or on a field, and so on and so on. So what strikes me is that the organized crime is so much pervasive in the business of illegal immigration that what comes to Europe is almost totally controlled by crime. So crime is an important element to target by our society, probably not to stop illegal migration, but at least to change the treatment of the migrants, to reduce the risk at the face of abuse and also the death toll, which in most cases is caused by people who have no scruples. They put people on dangerous situations.
Would it be wrong to say that you're arguing then for harm reduction? Because this sounds very much like what we did in the Netherlands with the coffee shops. The problem wasn't the soft drugs, it was the hard drugs. Keeping people away from the people who wanted to progress them to things that were more damaging, and you close your eyes to certain things in order to reduce the total harm.
Yeah, there are several strategies which could be applied. One, for example, one of the strategies would be advertise the condition of traveling of the people, the risks they have, and so on. This has been tried, and there are also other alternative measures, not necessarily judicial or law enforcement means, but we need to look at that and to reach out the countries of origin and transit where the most risky part of the trip comes, or the moment when people hide in a cargo which is full of tomato, which is fermenting, or put in other dangerous situations.
Which is why I was pleased to see so many partner organizations here at the event that Frontex works with to take harm prevention measures in the interest of preventing harm to me by the organizers. Since I'm already late, I'm afraid we must end this talk. I'm sorry if you wanted to ask a question and didn't get a chance, but I think we will all be here after the talk to take any further questions you have. Thank you all for your kind attention.